Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books, out loud. This is a little blue book. It just happens to be Little Blue Book number 1536, and it is entitled, Facing Death Fearlessly, and it was written by Joseph McCabe. And let's see, does it have a copyright date? Yes, it does. It was copyright 1930. And this is part 1, so we're just starting. Okay, page 1. Facing Death Fearlessly. 10 years ago, there came into my hands a privately printed book entitled Words in Pain. The title was accurate, for the volume consisted of letters that had been written by a lady who suffered from an incurable disease, yet had to wait 4 years for release. In fact, it was only the feeling that her husband and children intensely desired her to stay as long as possible that restrained her from ending her existence, as she eventually did. Much earlier, for a little over 4 years, she suffered severely, and from her chair at first, and then from the unescapable bed, she wrote these letters to her doctor. She was a Jewess, only 36 years old. Her husband was fairly prosperous and was devoted to her, and she had 4 dear children and a beautiful home. She was cultivated, quoting very frequently sentiments from Marcus Aurelius, whom justly she did not much like, or Huxley, for whom she had a supreme admiration, from Shaw and Wells, Swinburne and Provost, and so on. She had remarkable ability and intellectual lucidity. To this woman, the doctor shudderingly handed the sentence of death. And being that rare type of medical man, a devout Christian, he tried to give her the antidote of his faith with the terrible truth. But she was an agnostic, and these letters must have convinced at least one Christian that there are ideas which give greater courage in face of death than the tawdry expectation of a harp and a crown. I do not know a more beautiful self-revelation than I read in these letters, which were written with the belief that only one pair of eyes would ever read them. Her first feeling was, naturally, one of rebellion, not of bitterness or despair, but of deep and healthy regret that she must close so happy and promising a life several decades before its normal time. After a year's illness, she hardly remembered how she had received the first announcement that she must die. She wrote, "When I first knew my death was at hand, I stood facing the blank, black wall. Sobbing, I hammered at it, and with set teeth and clenched fist attempted to knock it down. To my vain and tired effort, it seemed but to increase in gloom or immovability, until my tear-dimmed eye perceived entrenched there not only the awful strength of immutable death, but greediness for its prey, the longing to crush me at once, even before my time, and pitiless joy over one more poor mortal's discomfiture." But her memory is unjust to her. Her earliest letters show that there was no sobbing and clenching of fists. The first letter is written with a suspicion that she has been condemned to death, and she asks quietly for certainty. "I am not a coward and do not fear death," she says, which to me means nothing more than sleep. But I cannot become resigned to leave this beautiful world with all the treasure it holds for me. Some months later, the doctor begins to press upon her the consolations of Christianity. And she replies as if she were one of the strongest and sanest of women. She needs no Christ. You find your ideal in a being who lived 2,000 years ago, and I look for mine in the beings who are going to live 2,000 years hence, or sooner, and towards whose creating we may all help. She has told her children, and she is greatly amused, because her little boy said that he and his sister would not really lose her, as they would keep her skeleton in the corner of the nursery. She has shocked the doctor by giving him the idea that she is an advocate of free love. No, she is not. But if there were no more legitimate and illegitimate children, but just children only, one of the greatest evils of the world would be removed. She discusses all problems and all literature and serenely confronts a future which is only very rarely relieved by some faint hope. "Death does not frighten me now," she says, after a few months. "I think it is like taking chloroform. Don't struggle against it. Hold the hand of a friend, and it is not half bad, with its promise of rest for me and heaven for you." A year after the first warning, she was writing cheerful letters to her doctor, from which I could take endless good things, but will just quote a few. "To me, a good man with his failings seems a better ideal man than a perfect God. We feel nearer to him and nearer to the possibility of attaining his standard. I am getting far too spoiled. spoiled. Spoiled now. My husband used to be a good hand at criticizing, but now, poor man, he sees only the best in me, which is foolish, undiplomatic, and wrong to the second wife. I try to remind him of the first years when our ideas did not always coincide, so that he may not lose heart when, in his next married life, things do not always run smoothly at first. I told my husband that I spent the whole Sunday morning in my bath chair, sharing it with a spider who, I hoped, was enjoying its life. I added that it was a smallish spider. I do not know if my philosophy would have stood one of the bigger ones. I am not ashamed that an occasional sob should reveal to me my human weakness, and to God, as you would say, my full appreciation of all the good I am leaving behind. When today I see a young couple walking hand in hand, a mother pushing her baby's pram or running with her children, or a woman on horseback, I watch from my chair, quite content to see others enjoy what I have so keenly appreciated, but at the same time I feel like shouting to each and all, including you, my dear friend, be happy, happier, happier still. Happiness is what we were born to, and happiness is a good aim in life. To get rid of the greater part of our responsibilities in life by placing them on God is by far the easier thing to do, but not the best way for making us strong and thinking well and acting still better. Have you heard of the Irish priest called by a peasant to bless a very unfruitful field? The priest looked round and said, "My friend, what is wanted here is hard work and manure, not prayers. The only thing one cannot buy are the only things worth having." These, remember, are words in pain, not the reflections of a comfortable lady in a cool mansion on the coast of Southern California. And the note is sustained to the end. One day, in the first year of suffering, her little boy said to her, "Don't die, Mummy. Promise me you won't die." She promised, and for 3 years she felt herself bound not to seek relief. I absolutely dread that my Jewish blood and Jewish toughness will keep me going some time longer. She wrote, yet she continued in the same mood. After 3 years of illness, I remain with a great balance of joy in my favor. Here, I left my bath chair, kissed my friend, and felt like hopping into the house, instead of sedately walking, as would become a dying invalid. But why should I, doctor, for the sun is shining, the birds are singing, and I, too, feel happy. Yes, completely happy. And everything is for the best, and the best of worlds. My wish is to be laid in my coffin with my eyes well open. Shall be a last protest against old creeds, old customs, old lies. Your creed, all creeds. I drive joyfully into a corner and would be happy to be able to help in driving them entirely out of the universe. The best of worlds rather shocked me. It always does. And from the pen of a young and fortunately placed woman dying of cancer, it sounded rhetorical. And sure enough, the next letter withdrew it. It is only a make-believe when I get meek and say all is for the best, and I despise myself less now when I have had a good cry. She had meant that all experiences of joy or sorrow wisely received tend to enrich life. The spring of the 3rd year found her very tired, but not in mind. The doctor may come to see her if the sun is not shining, but if it shines, he must take a walk in the park, and she will be with him in spirit. My spirit, that chatterbox, will have such a lot to say to you. First, it will rejoice with you over the sun, the blue sky, the shooting trees, and most of all over the snowdrops. If the fragile flower can pierce the soil to get at the light, why should we deem it impossible ever to get there? Like the snowdrops, we must push Valinity straight upwards through all obstacles, and if, like the snowdrops, our head gets bent from the effort, let it be. It does not matter so long as we have added new stores of joy and hope and faith to help those who follow us to get one step nearer the goal. Her goal is quite clear all through. Just a happier earth for everybody. And she is quite certain that it will come. She will die this year. Yet she is reading Edward Carpenter, Kropotkin, Lecky, Stevenson, Wells, Shaw, Oliver Schreiner. But I must make an end of it. With the 5th year the illness began. She was too exhausted to to see much of her children, and she felt it useless to go on. I have made up my mind to take the sleeping draught. Perhaps tonight, she writes a friend. She sees her husband suffering and will not prolong it. I am thankful to have managed to keep fairly bright to the end. Then 6 lines to her husband. They end. Marry again as soon as you can, and forget me as much as will be necessary for your future happiness. Of course, if you have a daughter, you must give her my name. She could not be happier than I have been. And on the envelope to this letter she wrote in pencil 2 lines of Shelley, which were the last expression of her brave faith. Awake him not, surely he takes his fill of deep and liquid rest, forgetful of all ill. It was Jacques Leaube who drew my attention first to this remarkable book, and asked me to make it known, so that the whole world might see how we skeptics really confront death. I am now spring cleaning my books, and this volume catches my eye. And it reminds me that I have lately got from America one of Dr. Cadman's counsels on his subject of death and how to confront it. So I put side by side the reflections of the comfortable man who hopes that death is still very far away and has probably never seen any but a Christian die, and the reflection of the skeptical woman who faced death for 4 years. It is like comparing soapy water. I will not say soda water, for that is clear and sparkling and champagne. The clerical oracle just puts words together. The dying woman expresses vital thinking. Cadman, the counselor of half a continent, knows nothing about it. This pain-racked woman, writing on her deathbed to a few intimates, knows all about it. I need not say much about Dr. S. Parks Cadman's reasons, or what he calls reasons, for believing in immortality, as they are much the same as those of another clerical oracle, whom I discussed in Little Blue Book number 1450, Do We Live Forever? First and most convincing is the usual deep desire in practically all hearts for more life and better. This is clearly the voice of nature, and nature is not prone to lie. As I said before, change the word life into money, and this very empty bit of rhetoric looks tawdry. Whether the desire to live on after death is still universal, or how widespread it is, need not even be considered. To make nature responsible for our wishes and then conceive it as a large, kind clergyman who could not be suspected of playing the fool with us is childish. There are many things which we just as naturally wish, but we smile at the idea that there is some obligation to somebody or something to realize the desire. Nature, in fact, would be rather puzzled if, in a playful moment, we imagined it as Dr. Cadman does. 300 million Mohammedans have the deep desire to live forever in large and luxurious harems, with the physiological law of fatigue entirely suspended. 300 million Christians have a deep desire to divest themselves of this flesh as soon as possible, and live in a world where sex is never mentioned and roast kid is unknown. 100 million agnostics, I think that, including all educated Chinese and Japanese, we number so many, have no desire, deep or otherwise, on the matter, and would rather know the conditions of a post-mortem existence before they wish for it, lest some djinn fulfill the wish and make them immortal in a world of boredom. Again, says the oracle, life is everywhere victorious over death on this side of the grave. Why should it not be equally victorious beyond the grave? Some of my friends think that I ought to be more courteous in criticizing these efforts of clergymen to prove the truth of their beliefs. How in the name of common sense can anybody deal courteously with such festoons of words as these? The plainest fact of life is that death is everywhere, victorious over it on this side of the grave. What the man must mean is that the body for a time victoriously resists the forces which tend to destroy or dissolve it. What is the sense of asking us whether it may not do the same after? We have seen that body go up in a volume of smoke in the chimney of the crematorium. Its constant renewal takes place under earthly conditions. It is a fair interference that it takes place under post-mortem conditions. Now what renewal can he possibly mean except the constant renewal of the matter of the body, and how in the name of all that is wonderful does he expect this after death? And the feebleness of it is covered by the usual assurance that those of us who cannot see these truths are fools. We are guilty of a strange use of the reasoning faculty, and we ought Herod in dogmatizing about the purely speculative. Then we are fools again because in our science we cannot measure the weight of an idea, and we lack confidence in the supreme mind. And in short, in the last line, Christ said that he would give us eternal life, and this sort of stuff is syndicated and probably pays the writer at the rate of $20 a square inch. There would be some point in discussing the general intellectual conditions which make an oracle of a man whose knowledge and intellectual vitality are so low, but for such readers as I have it would be tedious to discuss the stuff itself. Mr. Heidelman Julius once said, I believe, that America needs a few McCabe's. I differ. What it more urgently needs is 100 Heidelman Juliuses, or a syndicate of millionaires at the back of Heidelman Julius. The general intellectual level is not as bad as the broadcasting of feeble stuff like Cadman suggests. I have just had half a dozen workmen buzzing around me for a fortnight, and 3 out of 6 just ordinary painters who were miseducated up to the age of 14 and have been at the mercy of our British cadmums ever since, fell upon my little collection of books, and they painted my study with real interest. Their conversation was reported to me by my vigilant housekeeper. They could follow clear reasoning on problems of life and death with close interest. To one who was particularly interested in the question of immortality, I gave a copy of my History of Spiritualism. It was Friday night, pay night, when he regularly spent the evening at our best local cinema and vaudeville. He was heard telling a mate next morning that for once he deserted the cinema and read my book until 2 in the morning, and he would have to rise at 6:30. When they left, they carried off all my spare copies of Little Blue books, Key to Culture, Debunker, etc. There are probably millions of workers like them, but how does the ordinary bookstore, with its $1, $2, and $3 books, appeal to them? On such a question as this, or as that, which I am now discussing, the respective attitude toward death of the Christian and the skeptic, most people have very little experience to guide them. In the course of 6 decades, I have seen less than 6 people die, and apart from war, I suppose that is not an uncommon experience. But I have seen many in their last illness, or in the years when death might come at any moment, and I know well their attitude toward death, and have compared my experience with that of others. The clerical idea that skeptics fear death is absurdly wrong. It is in many cases based upon mendacious stories about the death of Voltaire, Hume, Paine, Ingersoll, Bradlaugh, etc. And it is in all cases based upon the morbid psychology of the dying Christian. A few months ago, a local clerical oracle came to hear me lecture in some Canadian town, and his people became alert and excited when, at the close, he rose to deliver his devastating questions. I had lectured on the evolution of man, about which he probably knew nothing. In any case, he wanted to put a completely unanswerable question, so, with becoming gravity, he was not a bad sort of fellow, he asked, "Have you anything to replace that consoling message of Christianity to the dying and the bereaved?" He was not quite an honest inquirer, for he wanted merely to impress his people by puzzling me. But he was, I think, an honest man, and he left that room a sad man. I merely asked him to consult his own experience candidly, and say whether his gospel had really lit up the eyes of the dying, or checked the tears of those who buried them. He bowed his head in silence. I added only that in my limited experience, first in the church and then in the skeptical world, I had honestly met more courage and serenity in facing death among skeptics, and less prostrating grief at the graveside. I know from authentic biographies or authentic witnesses very many and very different stories about how skeptics die. Very typical for the older man is the saying of my old friend George Jacob Holyoke when he saw the end approaching: "I have warmed both hands at the fire of life. It sinks, and I am ready to depart." It was W. Savage Landor, another skeptic, who had written this when his death was near. I have never known a skeptic of mature years who did not, in some form or another, have that sentiment. He might, like Beethoven, smile with gentle irony at the great performance that was closing and say to the group round his bed, "Ring down the curtain, my friends, the comedy is over." He might, like Labourchier, make a witty remark about hell with his last breath. He might, like a skeptical working man, whose son smilingly described his death to me, use up his last strength in telling improper stories. But I never heard of one who faced the future with anxiety, or did not surrender life with serenity. The death of the young, of people we love, is always sad, but the old consolation that we will meet again is losing its force. Even Cadman says that the question has been prejudiced by doctrines of immediate and eternal bliss or torment, which either present a heaven far beyond our prospective attainment, or a hell which the majority instinctively repudiate. The dream of Elysian fields, where we should presently rejoin those we loved, is nearly over. Even Christians are going back to the mood of the ancient Babylonians, to whom the future was all misty and uncertain. The fear of death was developed in the Middle Ages. There is, of course, an instinctive hostility to death in every normal human being and in every animal. It is not a calculated shrinking from the horror of non-existence or any other of the bogies invented by modern apologists for religion. It is as automatic a piece of behavior as stepping over a puddle. Any form of life in which hostility to death was not strongly developed would have perished ages ago. And the more life advanced, the more inevitable it was that this hostility to death should be strengthened. We might put it poetically that nature had a choice of two methods in preserving the species. One, the era of death had opened. Once the era of death had opened. For, as everyone knows, during the first few million years of uncellular life, each creature was normally immortal. When organisms begin to die, the perpetuation of the species might be secured either by bringing enormous quantities of young into the world, as the fishes do, or by developing this hostility to destructive forces. But these poetical expressions rather obscure the truth. There is no such thing as a nature that is interested in the perpetuation of a species, or of prolonging the story of life at all. What we call the instinct of self-preservation has developed in just the same way as the sexual impulse of the higher animals, those best fitted to live. Or to breed, live longest, and breed most, and generally speaking, like bred like. And I think we'll stop there for part 1.